Well, I'm Alex Martin. I am a priest here in the Diocese of Southern Ohio, and along with Kathy Baggett, chair the Commission on Congregational Life. And I have the pleasure today of sitting down with the Bishop of the Diocese, Tom Bridenthal, to talk about his recent trip to London. So, Bishop, thank you for doing with us today.
You're very welcome.
And could you start out by just giving some background and context about why you went to London or what they're doing?
Sure. Jason Fout, who's a professor at Bexley-Seabury Seminary, did his PhD work in Cambridge and got to know the Diocese of North London quite well. I'm not sure why, because Cambridge is not in North London, but he developed a lot of relationships there, and he was fascinated with that diocese because about 20 years ago it began a real reversal in its fortunes. It began to grow rather than decline. And it seemed that the reason for that was because they really embraced the Archbishop of Canterbury's Fresh Expressions program, which largely had to do with engagement with the neighborhood and with imaginative new ministries that were different from anything that was happening so far.
Right.
So he's been paying close attention to what's happening in the Diocese of North London and has developed a course called Learning from London, which is about 5 or 6 days in the Diocese of North London, being immersed in all kinds of different parish and ministry situations. And a year ago, the dean of our cathedral, Gail Greenwell, went on this course, and she insisted that I go. So I figured that I was under orders and had to go. So Margaret and I both traveled to London last January. And I'm really, really glad that we did. It was a fascinating, we know London pretty well, but we saw aspects of London, neighborhoods of London that were completely new to us. And since I'm also very interested in the development of fresh expressions of faith and ministry in this diocese, it's been very helpful for me to see what's happened in a context that's very different from ours, some of which I think is transferable to this diocese, some translatable to this diocese, some not so much.
Right.
But I'm still, in a sense, unpacking that trip. And I'm glad to say that Lynn Carter Edmonds, who's on my staff, was also there, and we've been able to sort of process it together since then.
And so you were there as part of this course with with students from Bexley-Seabury, or?
No, they were all about eight people, all post-seminary, not all.
So we could all do this.
We can all do this.
All right, good. Yeah. And so what happened, or what did you see while you were there that you were excited about, and what got you fired up and ignited your passion?
Well, I'll talk about one particular parish, which is up in Tottenham, which is an area of North London where there were, it's very racially divided. There were terrible riots there in the 80s. It has, there's a lot of drug addiction there. It's hard to get guns in England, which is nice, but it's not hard to get knives. So there's a lot of knife violence, a lot of teenage loitering. It's a neighborhood with a lot of the urban problems that we are familiar with in many of our cities. And there's a church in the middle of that area. And I'll pause there because one thing that was kind of exciting to see was the way in which Fresh Expressions largely involved the recovery, the rediscovery of what parish means in the Church of England. We think of a parish as a congregation,
right?
But the ancient notion of parish in England is geographical. So a parish church was meant to be the church that was serving the neighborhood that was around it, that was built in. And even today in England, anybody living within the boundaries of a parish has a right to call on the clergy there for baptism, for weddings, for anything. But in fact, you know, in North London, as in so many other places in England, hardly anybody went to church anymore. So there was a real divide between the congregation, such as it was, and the people that were living around it. So in this particular congregation, a priest that was funded by the diocese to go in and turn the place around, began by engaging very, very closely with the local schools, with the police department, with the fire department, with the local businesses, and just began to really live out what it means to be a parish priest in a neighborhood. And since this was a neighborhood undergoing some regentrification, he began to reach out to the unchurched or dechurched people that he thought might be able to help him expand his ministry. The place is full now. It's full. It's well connected not only with police, fire, schools, but it's also very connected with local businesses, and they even have a neighborhood Christmas carol party, and like 100 people participate in that. So for me, that was a very exciting thing to see, because I thought that is precisely the kind of thing that we're trying to experiment with in this diocese.
Right.
A literal going into the neighborhood that's really there, and serving the neighborhood, not saying what can you do for us, but how can we serve you, and the willingness to do that, to go into the schools, to tutor, to be provide chaplaincy to the firemen, to give business to the businesses, actually yielded a kind of a huge and growing thank you from the neighborhood that resulted ultimately in people beginning to show up at church.
Right.
So that's very exciting to me.
So it sounds like a lot of the growth and movement out into the neighborhood was birthed out of urban problems. But it also sounds like it's completely applicable across the spectrum, and could be applicable in this diocese even in rural areas.
I think a completely different situation. We visited a church which is in an extremely posh part of London, not far from Harrods, that had dwindled to just 20, 30 people, most of whom drove in from places like Kent and Surrey. And, it was a destination church with absolutely no connection to the neighborhood around it at all. A priest who had spent most of his ministry in South America and had done a lot of slum work, an Anglo-Catholic priest, very dedicated to that kind of work, but had been invited and asked by the Bishop of London if he would come and try to see what he could do with this parish. It's in the Brompton area, and actually not in Sloane Square area.
Okay.
If that means anything to you. Just a little aside here, when we lived in England in the 80s, the young adults who had lots of money were known as Sloane Rangers. So anyway,
Sloane Rangers.
That kind of place. And basically this church was full of aging Sloane Rangers.
Okay.
And by beginning to make friendships and relationships with all the businesses and restaurants that were around there, beginning to provide opportunities for fellowship for people very rich people who lived in the neighborhood but were very lonely, to begin to make that very, very beautiful church, by the way, known as a gathering place. Particularly, he focused on making it a place where children were welcome. There was a school attached to the church, and he really reached out very forcefully in that direction. So as he began to attract young families, and what was also wonderful was it was also same-sex as well as opposite-sex families with children. The place, it began, one thing led to another, and when we went to church there on a Sunday morning, there was 200 or 300 people there.
Wow.
It was wonderful, and lots and lots and lots of children who were completely welcomed and were so much a part of the scene. I'll never forget at the end of the service there was an icon of the Virgin Mary, and he went and stood in front of they did this every Sunday, and they sang the Angelus. and he had two children. He was holding their hands, and they were saying the Angelus with him. And he would genuflect whenever he genuflected, they went right down with him and right back up again. So that's a really different, completely opposite situation from Tottenham Court Road, but it actually operates on the same principle.
Which is?
Which is engagement with the neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And I must say, I think that clergy are a very important part of this. This is not not lay people are also, but I think that clergy who are visible and out in the parish, if you will, out in the neighborhood, make or break the Fresh Expressions work. Fresh Expressions also has to do with locating opportunities for ministry that are outside the church itself. So we visited one church that actually was in a suburb that had a big open air market on the weekends, and they had made the decision that they would just do church there. So sort of a version of street church.
Right.
But they would worship, but they would also provide people with coffee and food, and there was a mix of homeless people and people who were there to shop, and that had been going on for several years very successfully. There was a young woman who had moved into what had been the Olympic Village.
Okay.
And there was no church there at all. So she just got an apartment in the Olympic Village and began to, and wore her collar all the time, and began to walk around meeting, greeting, talking to people, and saying, if you want to do some church, come to my apartment, 7 o'clock on Sunday evening. Mm-hmm. And now she leads worship in her apartment every Sunday, and is beginning to baptize and to provide real spiritual leadership for people that were basically in a spiritual desert.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, let me just say that the COCL does a lot of work with parishes who are interested in revitalizing their ministry. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I think congregations often struggle with is just getting started.
Yeah.
And what is the first step? And so can you say anything about the process that took place?
And this is one of those things which may or may not be translatable to this diocese.
Right.
The evangelical movement is very, very strong in the Church of England. Most of the equivalent in this country is not in the Episcopal Church, mm-hmm. right? But there are two major sort of parties in the Church of England, the Evangelicals and the Anglo-Catholics. One very famous evangelical center is Holy Trinity Brompton, which is just around the corner from Harrods, also in a very rich area. But they have been concentrating on young adults for many, many years now, and they developed a catechetical program which is called Alpha, which probably is known to you and might be known to people that are watching this. But one of what they like to do is create Christians, if you will. Mm-hmm. And we went to church there actually on a Sunday evening, and there were about 2,000, mostly young adults there. But while they catechize, they also identify leadership and then invite them to develop their skills as leaders, and then send them out to congregations that are fragile all over London.
Right.
So congregations that don't know how to begin to turn regain their vitality. Many congregations don't even remember what it was like to have vitality. Will accept maybe 15 or 16 people or couples to come in and actually be with them, worship with them, become part of them, commit themselves to them.
And it doesn't feel like a hostile takeover.
Well, sometimes it does. It's controversial. But we did visit one congregation that had dwindled to about 8 people. It was an Anglo-Catholic congregation, but it was really just about to die. And they actually asked for help. They said, could give us some people. And so a group of people came, and this was about 6 or 7 years ago, and they came along with the priest, but they were all evangelicals, of course, and he'd been formed in the evangelical movement. But he said, this is an Anglo-Catholic congregation, we're not going to get rid of that. We're not going to get rid of the Mass, which was at 11 o'clock. So he had to learn how to wear a chasuble and how to swing the incense and to do everything that, Anglo-Catholics do.
Those are valuable skills.
Indeed,
That's right.
indeed. But he also established a prayer and praise service at 9 o'clock, then with a fellowship time in between. And he said, he was very funny about himself because he said I was a complete idiot trying to say Mass. Took me about a long time to learn how to do it. But after about 5 years, people began to cross over. And that church has become a kind of laboratory. People are very interested in seeing how that's working, how those two dimensions, polar opposites in the Church of England.
The prayer and praise in the Anglo-Catholic Mass.
Yeah.
And the people crossing between the two.
How those different traditions, different music, different piety, if you will,
right.
different approaches to Scripture, are beginning to be in real deep conversation with each other, and together, those two groups that have really become one group have then begun to really once again go into the neighborhood and to engage it in really very imaginative ways.
So it sounds like it all sort of goes back to that.
It all goes
following
back
Jesus
to that.
back into the neighborhood.
It all goes
right.
back to that.
Right. I think one of the great things about our tradition and Anglicanism in general is there's some consistency and people are very comfortable with it. And that can also be a detriment if people aren't willing to make changes. What would be your message to people in the diocese who might be hesitant to make any changes at all because this is the way it's always been and we're used to it this way and we like it this way?
Well, human beings don't like change.
Right.
I include myself
likewise.
in that. But there really actually can be no joy without change. To have no change is to be stuck, to be paralyzed, to be going nowhere. So, most of us are able to overcome our natural fear of the unknown in order to travel. And what I think the Church is being called to now is to a kind of spiritual traveling. To engage the neighborhood is a scary thing to do because we, in a sense, are stepping out of our own the area that we control into an area that we don't control. Our neighbors should call the shots if we're visiting them.
Right.
But that's the whole point of Jesus and of the gospel, is that we embrace the stranger, and to embrace the stranger is the same thing as embracing change, because we will be changed. Every new relationship changes us, and every new relationship brings the possibility for new discovery and for a sense of a closer sense of God's presence and God's call. I feel that very strongly. Just to go back to that bit about Holy Trinity Brompton and sending people into a church, at first that doesn't seem like something that would be easy to do here. We don't have a big evangelical engine, churning out missionaries. But we do have larger churches that have many resources that might be hesitant themselves to share some of their people. But what if some of our more fragile churches asked for that help, asked for some people? I don't think that's happened in the 10 years that I have been here. I think that we could find ways to experiment with the use of people in one congregation to help another congregation get going or to get started. And I've learned lately that several of the most vital churches in our in our diocese right now actually were started that way 25 years ago. In the case of one church I know of, 25 people volunteered to go to be in this other place for 6 months, and they ended up never leaving.
They stayed.
They stayed,
right.
And more than 25 people ended up taking their place in the church they had come from.
Wow.
So I think we've got to begin to take the risk to be generous in all kinds of ways with one another, and also to recognize that that's the way our tradition works. We we go to seed if we are isolated from one another, but we actually come alive and become missional when, first of all, we deal with each other as strangers, one congregation to another, and begin to practice on each other in order to have more courage to get to know the schools and the libraries and the businesses and the homeless people that are right next door to us.
Yeah, I think it was Bonhoeffer, someone who said that the church is the only organization anywhere in the world that exists for the benefit of people who are not its own stakeholders.
That was William Temple.
Was it Temple?
Archbishop of Canterbury.
There you go.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Architect of the total makeover of England after the Second World War. He was he was a very beloved Archbishop of Canterbury, and before that, Archbishop of Archbishop of York, and before that, Bishop of Manchester. Why? Because, unusual for bishops, he went out. He would walk the streets. He advocated for the coal miners during the great coal mining strike in the mid-20s. He was universally adored. Why? Because he followed Jesus into the neighborhood and modeled it.
Wow.
And because of his efforts, what is sort of, I think, sometimes as a put-down referred to as the welfare state, emerged as a state-sponsored movement to raise the standard of living of everyone to a decent place.
It sounds pretty Christian to me.
It sure does.
Doesn't it?
Yeah.
Is there anything else that you took from your learning in London you think it might actually be applicable to the diocese or translatable from there to here?
Yeah, we actually visited a Fresh Expressions seminary.
Oh, wow.
And its basic principle was, why would you, first of all, they were forming people for all kinds of crazy ministries, not just congregational ministry. But they were operating on the principle that it was not a good idea to remove somebody from ministry for 3 years or so while they went to seminary. So the seminary only operates 3 days a week very intensely, and the rest of the time students are expected to be doing full-time ministry, either in a Fresh Expressions situation or in a traditional congregation. So and they were not doing online stuff. The students were commuting from maybe 60, 70, 80 miles away to do that. And I think that is transferable. I would love to see if we could. I'm on the board of Bexley Seabury, and I would love to see if we could experiment with finding ways to use the fact that we are online a lot to turn our field ed program into much more of something that more like a curacy, and that might in turn help some places that are struggling.
Right. What about Fresh Expressions in general? I mean, can you say anything just about the sorts of ministries that they were doing in London?
Well,
I mean, outside of traditional parish contexts.
I was surprised to find that most of the Fresh Expressions focus actually was congregational.
Was it?
It really was this idea of re-embracing the old idea of the parish, really taking it really seriously. There was only one ministry that was completely non-congregational, that was considered Fresh Expressions, and that was a church that had been turned into a theater, and did a ministry to primarily African American, not African British, I should say, teenagers, teaching them how to act and how to write plays and then to perform them, and they were all, and it was always Shakespeare. But they would the person in charge, this is fascinating, would sort of give them skits to improvise that were really based on the play that they were eventually going to do. And so, for instance, for Romeo and Juliet, he said, improvise a skit about a knife fight. These are slum kids.
Right.
So and then they would record the stuff they were saying, and then eventually, maybe 6 months later, he'd say, "You have just created Romeo and Juliet," and they would read the play, and then they would figure out how to bring together Shakespeare's text and the improvised street language that they had developed.
Did this community still worship on Sundays, or was God involved in some way?
It was a priest who was doing it, and
Okay.
they prayed with the kids.
Okay.
Yeah. It was no longer a functioning congregation. It had.
But they were serving the community in a different
Yes,
way.
Yes.
Right. I just wanted to ask about resources available in this diocese to congregations who are interested in taking that next step to following Jesus into the neighborhood.
Well, I think there are a lot of resources that people are not aware of.
Right.
For one thing, my staff. I mean, everyone on my staff is completely available to any congregation at any time, particularly around issues having to do with the identification of assets. What are the skills, the people, the history, the concrete situation of a congregation that are unique and are the resources that are already there for them. Sometimes it takes an eye from the outside to be able to listen and to say, have you looked at this? Have you looked at this? So I would start there. I think my staff works very hard, but I think they would say that they're underutilized in a sense.
So they would love to get a phone call from somewhere in the diocese.
Absolutely, or an email or a text,
asking for
whatever.
help.
We also have a Fresh Expressions missioner who is extremely skilled in almost every aspect of that kind of work that would be able to help a congregation connect not only with its neighborhood, but also to connect with some of the Fresh Expressions communities that are beginning to develop. We have several intentional communities, maybe 3 or 4, 2 of them officially Episcopalian, but there are others who are in turn connected with all kinds of other networks of, again, mostly young adults who are trying to live lives of faith in new ways, who have a lot to teach our more traditional congregations, and who want to be associated with them, want to be connected. So I would love to be able to offer Brendan's Crossing, for instance, in Cincinnati, and Confluence, which is in Columbus, as resources for congregations, just to learn what is the perspective that these people bring to the church, which is different, but again, translatable to congregational life.
Well, would you like to offer any sort of final charge to congregations in our diocese who maybe feel like they're stagnant or struggling to figure out what to do next? And
well, I'm hoping that we are going to have a diocesan-wide convocation on September the 16th, which I'm calling the Exodus Convocation, which is going to be seeking to arrive at some kind of clarity about the direction that this diocese is going in. But more than that, to provide people with some concrete methods and principles that will help them engage their neighborhood in new ways. And so my first charge is, I hope people will come to that.
give us the date and
September the 16th,
16th at Proctor.
Yeah, but I think, we don't have to wait until September the 16th. I think that any congregation can give us some thought. Just take a walk and just see what's around, and then take the step of just one baby step to invite a relationship with one household or one school or one business or one other church. Start with the low-hanging fruit. Be brave enough to walk through the doors into a Lutheran church and say, what can we do together? Because I think that one step really leads to another. That once we take the step, the Holy Spirit will use that. So my charge, I'm like a broken record here, is don't try to do everything at once, because then one just becomes overwhelmed and one becomes paralyzed. But try for a tiny little bit of change and see what happens.
Right. Well, thank you so much for taking time to sit down with me today to talk about your learnings from London.
Well, thank you. Thank you for asking.